This is the Lazy Women podcast.
Because what we grow up with feels like home. So because what we so in that because what we so
Hello everyone, welcome to Lazy Woman podcast. Today I have an amazing guest as usual, Csenge Zalka, a storyteller and an academic, and she is the Hungary's first international storyteller. Welcome, Csenge.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
I first want to start with you. How was your journey of being a storyteller? Because it's an amazing profession and totally out of norm. And I'm saying it as a compliment, of course. And as I read in your website, it was, I think, passion from childhood, right?
Yes. I grew up with storytelling. My family told me a lot of stories, my parents, my grandparents, and I loved reading stories from a very early age. And when I was a teenager, I really loved mythology and legends and folk tales, and I just really wanted to share them with other people. So I just had this excitement to tell people, oh, this is such a great story. Let me tell you about this tale. And because I had, my grandparents and parents telling me stories, I kind of naturally knew how to tell them or how to pass them on.
Was that hard for you to choose it as a profession? Like, do you encounter any obstacles when you decided to do it?
Yes, when I started about 16 years ago, it wasn't really known as a profession in Hungary. So my parents were a little worried that I would not make any money, or like I couldn't make a living from storytelling. I was in university at the time. I was studying archaeology, which also doesn't make a lot of money. So, so they were a little worried, and I first had to tell people what storytelling is before I could ask them to hire me as a storyteller. So a lot of times I had to convince people, oh, yes, you want storytelling for this event. You want storytelling for your school or for your museum. It's a really good art form. It's really interesting. And then it's not just for children, and it's not just traditional folk tales. I can do all kinds of stories. And so I had to sell the entire art form first, and then I could ask them to hire me. So it was a difficult start, but I really loved doing it. And then I went to study it in the United States. So I learned a lot from American storytellers because over there it was already an established profession at the time.
But you literally build your career.
Yes, from the ground up, and like learning by a lot of trial and error, and trying things and then learning how to be a professional storyteller.
And I'm also wondering, like, how you keep track of tales. Are you interested in a certain themes, or maybe focusing on a region? What is your working process when you are researching about a tale?
I love stories from all kinds of cultures and all kinds of traditions. So I read a lot and I listen to other storytellers a lot. So I like expanding my horizons and learning about the traditions of other cultures. I work with traditional stories. I work with folk tales, legends, mythology. Very rarely do I ever tell, literary tales or tales that I make up. And the tales that I make up are usually based on folklore. I just, color them and expand them in a way that they become, my stories. But I mostly work with traditional stuff. I mostly work with folklore. And I keep reading, I keep searching, and when I come across a story that just makes me go, oh, this is amazing, then that's the story I know I want to tell. I only ever tell stories that I really love. I don't choose stories based on, oh, this is important, or oh, this has a good message. It has to be a really good story that I really want to tell for it to work, because I think that makes the telling more exciting too, if I actually love the story that I'm telling.
Yeah, because it's not a thing that you can be fake. You have to be really natural. It's a performance, but you have to have this feeling to be able to give it to the other side.
Yes, it's very personal. It's it's not a performance for me. as much as it's talking with the audience and just, having a conversation and telling them something really cool. It's not rehearsed. It's not, it's not the text that I'm learning or reciting, and there is no fourth wall between me and the listeners. It's a very communal experience. It's a very interactive experience. So if I don't like the story that I'm telling, or if I don't believe in the story that I'm telling, then it's not going to be natural.
And our stories change a lot every time you tell, or is it just minor changes?
It depends on the audience. At first, when I start telling a story, it keeps changing a lot. I usually, with traditional stories, I usually try to keep to the original storyline, and I just embellish it or color it, or react to the audience. If the kids have a question or somebody makes a joke and I'm like, oh, that's really funny, I'm going to put that in the story. So and if I only ever told this story to adults, I will change it when I'm telling it to children. Maybe it becomes more interactive, or there are more questions in it. So it really depends on the context of the telling. But yeah, no actual oral storyteller tells the story the same way twice. It always changes a little bit, at least.
Actually, this question is a little bit related to our mission as a lazy woman, because listening to a story with full attention and without doing anything else or being the narrator is a quite foreign to the hustle culture we live in. We are always busy or impatient for something these days. How does it feel for you to be in this profession in this age of world? Like, is it kind of protecting you and creating a space for you?
Yes, very much so. And I find that people have a craving for it. People really want that kind of personal connection that storytelling gives them. It's my day job. My full-time job is that I work for an NGO here in Budapest, where we bring storytelling to foster homes, to children's homes. So our entire philosophy is that these children who for some reason can't live with their families or don't have families don't get a lot of personal attention. So what we do is we go and tell them bedtime stories so they can have that experience of settling down, curling up on the couch and listening to a story. And when I'm telling that story, 100% of my attention is on the kids, and they get that kind of attention when somebody's talking to them, somebody's telling them a story. They have agency over asking questions or making comments, and they get that kind of familiar feeling of spending that bedtime story time with someone every week. And it's a lovely job, but it also shows you how much it can mean to someone to get that kind of personal storytelling, not from a TV, not from not from the internet, not from a book. Even it's another human being personally spending time with you and giving you attention and telling you a story. And I think especially these days, not just children in the foster system, but basically everybody is really craved for human contact, for attention, for not having a screen between you or not having a screen in front of you. It's a very different experience, and I think it's very much needed.
Yeah, and as you said, reading a story is never the same and not a substitute, actually, because the intimate relationship you build is really important.
Yes, although I do love reading, and I think it is also very important to read with children and make them, love books and love reading very early on. I don't think it's an either or situation. I love, sharing favorite books with people, or I look forward to sharing my favorite books with my children when I have children. So I think both of them are very important, but they work in very different ways.
Yeah, it's for different needs of children. I know that a woman image in fairy tales or folk tales are more than bad stepmothers or naive princesses, but we can say that maybe the most popularized ones are like this. And that we have really different versions of every tale, of course, and currently the gender roles in tales is an important discussion, and I actually don't know what to think about. What do you think about the gender roles in all tales, and should we civilize or modernize them, or we should like keep them as what they are, as a cultural asset, or what do you think?
Good questions. Okay, the first one, I think a lot of these stereotypes that folk tales or fairy tales are very outdated in terms of gender roles. I think that comes from selection. So as you said, the most popularized tales, the ones that were canonized, there is like a European, at least in Europe, there's a European fairy tale canon that most people are familiar with, and it's mostly Grimm or French fairy tale tradition, and it's the ones that from Disney. Basically that's what it is. Like most people, when they think of a version of Snow White, they think of the Disney story, which is especially obvious when they talk about how the prince kisses Snow White to wake her up, and that was not even the part of the Grimm tale. Like the Grimm tale, they are carrying the coffin and they trip and the apple falls out of her mouth. So there was no kissing to begin with, but people make this huge fuss about the prince kissing Snow White, and that's Disney. That's a Disney thing. So you can often tell that when people talk about folk tales and fairy tales, they talk about Disney. But it comes from selection. This entire European fairy tale canon, it comes from selection because people keep republishing and republishing and retelling the same 8 or 10 fairy tales that everybody knows here in Europe and North America, let's say. And it's different in other areas in the world. But there are many folk tales in tradition that were what we would now call feminist. I published books of feminist folk tales in Hungary, and feminist Hungarian folk tales even, and people were very upset because they thought that I changed the stories. They were very upset that I was changing the folk tales. And that goes to your second question about should we change the stories or not. And I think if we do the selection right, we have to change them a lot less, because these feminist folktales existed in tradition. I didn't have to change anything in them. They were just not known. They were not popular, or they were not published. They came from the archives, they were collected but never popularized. So if you dig deep and you start looking for those feminist folktales, they exist. There are a lot of, woman heroes, clever women, brave women, and also men that fit, feminist standards, like caring fathers and supportive husbands and all of those things. So these exist, and if you find them and you tell them, then your repertoire becomes more diverse. With that said, as a traditional storyteller, like I learned from my grandparents, I learned storytelling from my grandparents, and then I spent a lot of time studying traditional storytelling and studying folklore. Traditional storytellers have always changed their stories, because your responsibility is to your audience, it's to your community, it's the people that you're talking to. It's not the people that lived 200 years ago. Nobody expects you to tell a story the same way it was told 200 years ago, because 200 years ago that story was current. That story was the common language. That story was the jokes and the references of that era. It wasn't a historical object. It's a living thing. And as a traditional teller, I believe that it is within the tradition to update your stories. Like parts of Hungary, where they could still collect folk tales in the 1970s and 1980s. You could collect folk tales from the oral tradition when the prince was flying in an airplane and calling the princess on the phone and bringing exotic fruits from South America for his wedding. Like there are these things, like people updated their folk tales because that they were responding to their current world that they lived in. And it only became an artifact, like a frozen thing, when we started writing them down. The moment we wrote the folktales down, people started thinking, oh, this is the text. This is how I have to tell it. Like this, it has to stay this way. And there is a type of storytelling when that's your goal. It's, like reenactment. It's like historical reenactment, when you believe, okay, I will show you how this story was told 200 years ago. And that's fine, That's a genre, that's a style, that's a type of storytelling that you can choose to do, but it's not a requirement from traditional telling to keep the stories as they were. It's very interesting to hear them that way. It's important to preserve the texts and make them available for research and for, folklorists and historians and reenactors, but it's not necessarily a rule that they have to stay that way.
And I read it somewhere. The fairy tales written by mostly men, as you said, like Grimm brothers, etc. But the storytelling was always woman dominated. I can't remember where to read, but maybe traveling around the world or a continent and collecting stories was probably not that suitable for women in that time. But do you think, is it correct? It has a woman dominated history, and is there a relationship between this how tales chosen, like you said before?
There could be. It very much depends on culture. So I wouldn't say, as a blanket statement, I wouldn't say, oh, all around the world this is the case. This is probably true to European traditions, to some European traditions. But for example, in Hungary, and I know Hungarian storytelling best, there were male and female storytellers. It's not an either or. Collection, yes, just from the nature of, science or early science. Collectors were very often men, and they very often didn't get the women's stories because they were not allowed to talk to the women, or because the women didn't trust them, you know. So once you have a woman folklorist, then she can get to spaces and communities that they wouldn't trust the men. So Hungary is very lucky that we had a lot of very excellent women folklorists, and they would go and talk to the women in the villages, and they would not only collect folk tales from them, but they would also collect their life stories. And those are very important stories too, about life and death and marriage and children, and just their lives that they wouldn't necessarily tell to some men who came down from the city. They wouldn't admit things to them that they would admit to a woman. So yes, in collection terms, it's very important that women also collect folklore. It really varies around the world who the traditional tellers were. There are traditions when the men and the women had different stories, for example, which is really interesting, that they carried different stories. But it really depends on culture. I wouldn't say that all cultures are women dominated or men dominated. It's very colorful, and it's very complex.
Hmm. I get it. You mentioned your book about this feminist Hungarian folk tales, and I wonder how is the representation of women in Hungarian folk tales, and maybe how is different from Western Europe or inside the Carpathian Basin.
Um, a lot of the stories that I looked at belong to folktale types that exist around Europe, or they exist all around the world. Folklorists have numbered the most common stories, like, Cinderella is 510, Snow White is 709. So they number these folktale types, and these types exist in many, many countries. What makes most of them qualify as a feminist folktale is the details. So I was looking at many, many different versions of the same story, and then finding one where it fits it. To me, it says something important. It has those values. For example, if you're familiar with, I think Anderson has a version of it. It's the Seven Swans, with the girl, the type of the story when the girl's brothers are cursed, and then she has to break the curse on them, and she has to do something to save them and change them back. So I was looking at many versions of that, and the story is basically the same, but sometimes they turn into crows, and sometimes they turn into swans, and sometimes they turn into ravens. I find a version where she sets out to save her brothers, but it starts with them being half siblings. So it starts with the father remarrying and having a baby daughter with his new wife, and they love their mother. So it shows a mosaic family with half siblings, where the siblings love each other, and the parents love the siblings. And it's not like, oh, and then there was an evil stepmother who hated them. It's not, the story is still the same, but now you have this representation of a family that is not hateful, or a stepmother that is not hateful. And to me, that's very important. And then later on, instead of the most commonly known version where she has to like stay silent and take all the abuse and take all the hardships and not say a word, and then she has to make shirts for her brothers to save them. In this Hungarian version, she actually has to go and get water from a magic well, and she has to outwit a group of bandits or robbers who are guarding that water. And then she's helped by a girl who's being captured by the bandits. So it's two girls working together to outwit the bandits and then get the water and break the curse. So it's active female heroes. It's active women who are breaking the curse. They are not breaking it by silence and obedience and just accepting abuse.
Yeah, she's going to an adventure, not sitting.
Yes, it's the same tale type, but the details make it very different. So a lot of times when I work with feminist folktales, they are very commonly known types, but the details are different.
Mhm. And I was really attracted by I think you mentioned on Twitter the she-wolves in Estonia. There was a legend you mentioned. Is there similar like wild woman stories in Hungary?
Um, Kind of, yes and no. Hungary, yeah, we have a lot of fairy stories, and our fairies are, mythical creatures. They usually live in water, so they are water-based fairies, and that would, but they are not the kind of wild women type that you would think of. And then we have witches, and we have two kinds of witches. We have the hags, I guess, who are not, those are not human. That those are the hag of fairy tales, the evil witch of fairy tales. But then we also have legends about women who learn magic, and those are the other type of witch. Those are human women who earn their powers somehow. And in most of these stories, they are bad or they are evil. But once again, for the feminist folk tales, I managed to find some stories where the witches were kind or helpful, or they are supporting younger women or helping younger women or helping younger men achieve their goals or succeed in life. So I guess that's the closest that we have is these witches living in the woods that we have in Hungarian tradition. The wild woman type is not very well known here.
Is it a common thing to having this type of wolf and wild woman myths across the Europe? Or is it like some kind of a unique story for Estonia?
I was having a really hard time finding female werewolves. Well, I was making my own job harder because I was looking for female werewolves who show up as positive characters, and also who have a good story, because a lot of times you have these beliefs of, these things exist, but that's not a story. You want a narrative that you can tell, because I was doing this research for a summer camp, and summer camp theme was transformations. So I wanted to tell a story of a woman turning into a wolf that was a positive story, and it was an exciting story, and and it was a full narrative, and that was extremely hard to do. So I did a lot of this research, but yes, I came across the existence of werewolves, or wolf shapeshifters rather, and even female wolf shapeshifters in Europe. There was a huge tradition of them in Portugal, in Portuguese folklore. There are these girls who go and live with the wolves, which is really fascinating. But most of these stories did not end well, or they were not portrayed in a positive light. So the thing with the wild women stories, understandably, in like patriarchal societies, women going off and doing wild things in the woods is not okay. So the stories will be about how this is a bad thing. It's really hard to find those narratives that portray wild women as positive or as free, as liberated. Yeah, so it's a really complex. Like, for example, the fairy tale that the 12 dancing princesses, the girls who sneak out every night and they dance and they tear their shoes. Yeah. So they researchers traced that story back to ancient Greece. There is the earliest version that we know of that story comes from Greek mythology. And in that version, the princesses are going to a bacchanalia. So they are going out at night and they are doing that wild bacchanalia thing that, in ancient Greece, the worshippers of Dionysus. So their father hires a priest to purify them, basically to tame them, and like take the madness of Dionysus off the princesses, and they like hunt them through the woods, because this is, in Greek mythology, in Greek culture, ancient Greek culture, this whole like civilization versus wild nature thing was between Dionysus and Apollo. So the earliest 12 dancing princesses, they are actually going to a bacchanalia. And then in Hungarian versions, in many Hungarian versions of this same folktale type, they are going to witches gatherings. So they are witches, and they go out at night to dance with the devil, or participate in witch parties. It sounds like fun, but in many of our versions, they actually got punished in the end. Like they got burned at the stake, or executed for dancing with the devil. So like, as pretty as the grim version of that story is, there are darker versions out there, and it's the entire idea of women sneaking out at night and going to wild parties was something that patriarchal values didn't like. And dancing is itself is a metaphor, because in some of the Hungarian versions of this story, they actually get pregnant. So going out to dance, it's just general freedom, like going out and dancing and being unsupervised, and doing things that's dangerous, and then they get punished. But there are some versions of this story when they don't get punished, and I like those versions better, usually from female storytellers. Go figure.
And I also thought about, there was a movie called Wolf Walkers, like a shapeshifter little girl. Was that a like Irish myth, legend, or something? I don't know. I just want to ask that this shapeshifting was also common in there, maybe.
Yes, yes. At one point, I did a lot of reading about shapeshifters. I sometimes I have an idea, or something that I get interested in, and I do a whole lot of research. And yes, wolf shifters are very common, not just in Europe, but in other continents as well. And it's really a whole fascinating topic of shifting into any kind of animal, really any kind of shapeshifters, but especially wolves for some reason. It's very fascinating when you read more about it. But yes, they do exist in many cultures.
And my last question is about your PhD in cultural studies, because I got really amazed by the name of your dissertation. It was the forum based role playing games as a digital form of storytelling, because I never thought about it in a storytelling way before. It's like kind of from the circle around the fire to the role playing games, but it's still the need of storytelling, I think. What do you think about this concept? Like, do we need stories to survive?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And we get our stories where we can. Now we get stories from movies, from books, from podcasts, whatever. You get your stories wherever you can, and people need stories, and they want stories, and they think in stories. People process the world in stories. Whether it's anecdotes or novels or film, it's we think in stories. To me, the role-playing game part was interesting, because that has that extra aspect of community. So traditional storytelling belonged to a community. When you were telling a story, you were there with your listeners. Traditionally, that was a shared experience. And that's different with digital media, when you're passively, listening or watching something. But with role playing games, you are back to sitting around a table, not a campfire, but a table, and creating a story together, and being immersed in the story and telling the story, and everybody participates and everybody puts their part into this interactive experience. So to me, role-playing games were interesting, because even in the digital format, even online, when people play in writing, because I was looking at forum games. Even in a digital format, it's a communal experience. It's a community thing. It's a story creation together in an interactive way. And to me, that kind of circled back to very close to the oral tradition. So that was my entire dissertation, to look at how even in the digital space, we kind of circle back to those elements of traditional storytelling that have been with us for, thousands of years.
Thank you, Csenge. This was all for my questions. And I learned a lot and I got curious a lot about about the stories you told us. Thanks again and thank you for coming today.
Thank you.
Because what we grow up with feels like home. So because what we
The Lazy List.
because what we
Hi Lazies! I prepared a list for the ones who enjoyed the interview and wants to read or listen more on this topic. You can find all the necessary links in the episode description. So let's start. Number 1 is the Multicolored Diary. This is the English blog of our guest Csenge Virag. She is sharing folk tales from all around the world. And she has a section for feminist folk tales and also a section called Weird Things in Folk Tales, which I believe you will enjoy it a lot. Number 2 is The Fairy Tales of Madame d'Aulnoy, a collection published by University Press of the Pacific. Mary Catherine d'Aulnoy usually referred as the person who created the term fairy tale. It is known that she wrote her first fairy tale at the end of 16th century. The main theme of the fairy tale she wrote and became a hit was the characters made their own choices in opposition to an arranged marriage, and it was quite unusual. She usually exaggerates the gender roles and make fun of them in her stories, like stories where the princesses chases after the prince. If you are wondering the fairy tales which have not chosen by Grimm brothers, I recommend you to check out the collection of Madame d'Aulnoy. Number 3 is The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. In this book, writer creates a fascinating dark stories based on the essence of fairy tales, such as Bluebeard, Beauty and the Beast, Snow White. And especially the Bluebeard stood out as a feminist version and widely known. Number 4 is Wolfwakers by Tom Moore and Ross Stewart. Wolfwakers is my favorite animated movie I watched recently. Based on an Irish folktale, I recommend this film for those who love stories about shapeshifters and love to watch rebellious girl as a main character. The last thing on the list is a podcast. It's Let's Talk About Myths Baby by Liv Albert. When it comes to folk tales, of course, your path crosses with mythology at some point. As we realize while reading Greek and Roman mythology, this world is full of horrible men, rape, and so many details that annoys us. Liv has a degree in English literature and classics, and she will introduce you to the most fun mythology adventure you will ever have, with a feminist perspective and mocking toxic masculinity. It has a lot of episodes. You can search for the heroines you are curious about and just have a look at them, but my advice is to listen them all. I'm a huge fan of hers, and she has also a book called Greek Mythology, The Gods, Goddesses, and Heroes Handbook. It's in my list but didn't have a chance to buy it yet, so I might also recommend it to you. Thank you for listening and hope to see you soon.